Welcome back to Milan Recording Studios. My name is James Pavel Shakras, and in today's video I have a comparison between probably two of the coolest digital pianos that I have ever found, the Korg SV-1 and the Korg SV-2. The Korg SV-1, for those of you who don't know, is actually almost a decade old, if not more than that by now, and it's a very, I guess you could say in these days it's practically ancient. It's been around for a very long time. It has remained basically unchanged since the very beginning, but yet it still manages to hold its own against modern digital pianos, which has always been very impressive to me about the SV-1. The idea behind the original SV-1 is to kind of emulate the vintage feel and sound of many vintage electric and digital pianos. The Fender Rhodes, the Wurlitzer 200, FM synthesis type sounds, tone wheel organ sounds, and also a few other miscellaneous things thrown in there as well. The SV-1 did it all. It had a screenless, very 70s style aesthetic and user interface that was very simple to use and overall was pretty fantastic. However, even many years ago, people wanted to have a successor, something that did more and that was better than the already very good SV-1, which of course is pretty difficult to do. However, by 2020, Korg has finally found out a way to do that, and so the SV-2 came out. The SV-2 has double the sounds of the SV-1, double the memory of the SV-1, and is, in my opinion, double the fun of the SV-1. So in today's video, I'll be comparing the differences and the similarities between the SV-1 and the SV-2. I'm not sure I'll really be able to say that one is necessarily better than the other, because honestly I still love the SV-2, and obviously there are things that are better about the SV-2, and I do love it probably as much as I did the original SV-1, but the SV-1 still holds a special place in my heart, and I don't really know if I'll even want to get rid of mine, even though I do have the SV-2. So first of all, let's talk about some of the physical differences about the SV-1 versus the SV-2, and then in a few minutes we'll get on to the sonic differences between the two. As you can see down here, the SV-2 is a cream color, whereas the SV-1 is a black color, and this is because this is the SV-2 88S variant of the SV-2. The SV-2 comes in a 73 key and an 88 key model, and it also comes in a model with speakers, and that's called the 88S. The S stands for speakers, and so as a result, the SV-2S is white, or this cream color, and it also has speakers in the back of the instrument. The SV-1, no model of it actually had internal speakers, so this is a big selling point for the SV-2S. They also make a standard SV-2, which is black and almost indistinguishable from the old SV-1. It looks very similar and really retains that same unique style. But the SV-2S is the one I really wanted to try out because the internal speakers sounded like a really cool idea to me, and honestly, they're pretty decent. They're definitely not the greatest speakers you'll ever hear, but they do the job, and they do have a pretty warm, fat sound. I do notice that they do seem to cut off a lot of the high frequencies and also much of the low frequencies as well, but they are decent inboard speakers, and they're definitely not the worst I have heard. As far as the visual layout of the SV-2 versus the SV-1, you can see that they're almost identical. If you've used an SV-1 for even a year and you're familiar with it, the SV-2 will be second nature. All of the knobs are in the exact same positions, and they're all almost labeled the exact same things. You will notice a few small subtle naming differences. For example, the compressor on the SV-1 is now labeled red compressor, the boost of the SV-1 is now labeled treble boost, and a few other small little names like that. For example, in the amp simulator, instead of just being a generic amp 1, amp 2, amp 3, they're now called clean, twin, tweed, AC30, and boutique, instead of just generic amp 1, amp 2, and amp 3. In the modulation effects, instead of just being chorus 1, chorus 2, it now says classic chorus and black chorus. Instead of phaser 1 and phaser 2, it now says orange phaser and small phaser, and instead of flanger and rotary, well, it still says rotary, but it now says MX flanger instead of just flanger. So very small naming scheme differences of the SV-2 versus the SV-1, but overall very similar. Another difference is about the knobs of the SV-1. First of all, the master volume knob of the SV-1 actually has a cheaper feel than the master volume of the SV-2. This could be because I've used mine a bit and it's kind of loosened up, but it could just be because the master volume had a bit of a lighter feel than the SV-1. The big difference, though, between the feel of the knobs, which I don't even know why I'm talking about this, but it's just a big difference I noticed, is that the knobs of the SV-1 are very clicky, at least some of them. The ones that have 11 different positions are pretty easy to turn, but the ones that only have 6 are very hefty knobs. You have to really squeeze and really muscle around to get them to turn. You can hear the difference of the feel just by the sound alone. Listen to these. They have this nice satisfying click that's it gives them a very high quality feel. The same 6-position knobs down here, as you can see, are much easier to turn. Now, I'm not saying this is a negative thing about the SV-2, but I am saying that one thing about these is that the SV-2 and the SV-1, because of this, don't really make a good pair. If you want to make some changes on the SV-1 and you want to go wrench these knobs to turn them, and then you want to also go make some changes on the SV-2 and wrench the knob to turn it, because that's what you expect, you're going to find that you're going to turn that knob way farther. Sometimes you'll push it in, which will activate effects, things like that. So the SV-1 and the SV-2, in my opinion, I thought they'd work really well together, but just that alone kind of makes them difficult to use together, in my personal opinion. I can see why Korg would have changed this, because the knobs could be difficult to turn with somebody who perhaps has arthritis in their hands or cannot squeeze something very hard. You do have to squeeze these knobs pretty hard, and these, as you can see, you don't at all. So for some people, that definitely would be a benefit. I personally liked the clicky feel and the very satisfying feel of these knobs, but I also don't mind the feel of these. They're nice as well. One of the biggest visual differences between the SV-1 and the SV-2, other than the obvious color difference, is the fact that the SV-1 has a big flippy switch over here on the side, and the Korg only has a button. The SV-2 only has a button to push it on and off. Not a big deal, but this is very satisfying to turn on and off. The button down here just kind of lacks that cool vintage feel. This is a switch similar to what you might find on an old Hammond organ or something like that. It's not the same, but it's a similar style, and that really helped bring in kind of some of that vintage feel. The button down here just simply doesn't do the same, but it does have the same function and turns on the instrument. So I think we've got everything all set back to the way things should be set to, so now I think let's give a bit of a sound demonstration. Now, one thing here is that the sounds between the SV-2 and the SV-1 are not exactly the same. For example, if I went to the second EP category and selected the second sound of the SV-2, it would not be the same sound at all as going to the second EP category and selecting the second sound up here. So they won't be exact matches. Korg has switched up a lot of the sounds in the instrument and changed the positioning of them. But I will go through here and find all the sounds that are similar to each other and give you guys a taste of them. As I said, there are double the amount of sounds in the SV-2 as in the SV-1, and you can access a second bank of sounds by pushing this knob in. The light will actually light up green, and then there will be a whole second variant of sounds down here. So you have the A bank, which is red, and you have the B bank, which is green. So to label them, it's like, called 2A or 2B, and that's what I'll be calling them in this video. So let's start off here with A1 down here of the SV-2, and we'll start off with the first variant of the electric piano up here on the SV-1. The SV-1 doesn't have that function. You can't push this button in to activate a second layer of sounds. There's only 6 different sounds per category and 6 different sections. Down here, there are 12 different sounds per category, and there are 6 different categories. Let's try out the first EP. As you can hear, while this particular sound of the SV-2 and the SV-1 both are emulating the sound of a Fender Rhodes, in my opinion at least, they sound like two completely different Fender Rhodes. The SV-1 is a bright, barky Rhodes sound, and the SV-2 is more of a mellow, toned down, warmer type of Rhodes sound. When I first unboxed and began to play the SV-2, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit confused and almost disappointed with the mellowness and the warmness of the sounds, but after a while, I literally warmed up to the SV-2 and I genuinely enjoy the sounds. You do have a lot of control over the touch sensitivity of the SV-2. If you hit the touch button, you can actually go through and change the touch sensitivity. So if you want to make the Rode sound brighter, you can either select a different Rode sound, because they do all have slightly different flavors, or you can simply change the touch sensitivity, which can help out a lot. So you can definitely tell that the SV-2, just right off the bat, and you'll see this as a kind of recurring theme, the SV-2 has a different color palette and a different color sound, a sound color, than the original SV-1. The SV-1 is bright and punchy, and the SV-2 is a little bit more mellow and a little bit more toned down. As I mentioned, there are 12 different sounds per category of the SV-2 versus 6 up here on the SV-1. So let's just select the second here for the SV-1, and then we'll also select the second for the SV-2. They won't be a direct match, but it'll still give you guys an idea of the kind of sounds each instrument is producing. So clearly those are two different Fender Rhodes sounds. The one up on top here has a phaser on it, and the one on the bottom does not have a phaser on it. That is one thing I have noticed about the SV-1 versus the SV-2. Let me find one on here that uses that phaser. I could always just slap the phaser onto an existing sound, but I want to see if there's one. Here's one that uses the phaser just by default, straight out of the factory. Let's compare that one. This is 2B on the SV-2. Let's try out that one compared to the one up here on the phaser, and then we'll change the different sound of the effects using that same sound, and we'll see if there's any difference of the chorus and the phaser effects from the SV-2 to the SV-1. I think I'll save checking out the rotary sound for the actual organs that would actually use a rotary sound, but as you can hear, the effects between the chorus and the phaser between the SV-1 and the SV-2 are quite similar. I think the two choruses are considerably different, but I think the phasers and the flanger are actually quite similar between the SV-1 and the SV-2. Of course, you can change the settings, the speed, and the intensity of both, but I left them at the way the factory had just for that really quick comparison, and they were actually the same between both instruments. I was watching that to see if the speed and intensity would change from the SV-1 versus the SV-2, simply just scrolling through the effects, and it did not. So that was, I think, a pretty relatively fair comparison between the two, and that is the sound of the effects. You will be hearing a lot more of those later on in the video, and of course, like I said, you can change the speed and intensity. While I'm discussing the speed and intensity, I figured I'd mention one cool thing that's changed about the SV-2 versus the SV-1, and I'll select one of these over here so you might be able to see it a bit better. When you are selecting, say for example, the tremolo over here of the SV-1 versus the SV-2, when I take the knob on the SV-1 and I scroll it, you can hear that with each click, 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 it actually will move the light on the dial of the SV-1. So each click of the knob corresponds to one varying degree of sound. So one click of the knob goes from 3 to 4. The next click goes from 4 to 5. The next click goes from 5 to 6. You get the idea. Down here on the SV-2, though, it's actually different. One click of the knob does not go from 4 to 5. It actually takes about 9 to 10 clicks of the knob to go from 4 to 5. And obviously this is a very good thing. We now have way more control over the sound, the speed, and the intensity of the tremolo and the other effects of here as well. You've got the modulation effects and the ambient effects, which is reverb and delay, that all use the same exact thing. The only thing that hasn't changed between the SV-1 and the SV-2 as far as the sensitivity of the knobs is the speed of the vibrato. It actually, instead of just going from from like 0 to 1 and then 1 to 2 with each click of the knob, it actually skips one, so it goes from 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6. So for some reason, with the speed of the vibrato, it's nowhere near as customizable with the SV-1 or the SV-2. I was hoping that would be something that's fixed on the SV-2, but for some reason that was not done. But other than that, all the other sounds do have a much wider gradient of settings you can put them at, which I think is fantastic. Let's continue on with our comparison of the sounds. Like I said, because there's kind of twice as many sounds of the SV-2 as on the SV-1, it does make it tricky to really go through and compare all the sounds. So I think what I'm going to do from here on out is what I'm just going to do is scroll through the sounds and play a couple chords on each sound of the SV-2 and on the SV-1. And when I find two that are similar, I might compare them, but just to give you guys an idea of the colors and the sounds that the SV-2 can produce and the SV-1 can produce, let's do that. Let's start off from the very beginning. We'll go back to E piano 1, play a couple chords on each one of those to remind you guys of what that sounds like, and then we'll just continue on from there. So clearly, as you can see, all the sounds of the first bank of the SV-1 and the first bank of the SV-2 definitely do not correspond to each other. On the SV-2, those last few sounds, the last four sounds of the SV-2 are Wurlitzer sounds, and the last two up on the SV-1 are actually FM synthesis type pianos. So they're kind of mixed up in the different categories of the SV-2, so if you're used to an SV-1, you will have to get used to where the different sounds are located, but that hasn't been much of a challenge for me. One of my favorite sounds of the SV-2 is that last one in category, the first category, and then it's 6B is absolutely stunning, and I love that Wurlitzer with the chorus effect. It's gritty, it's rich, and it's really, really wonderful. Let me just play a little bit more of that because I absolutely love that sound. It's one of my favorites of the SV-2. That hiss you can hear there is coming from the amplifier section, which kind of creates a gritty, vintage type of an amp sound. I'm not sure if you can actually tone down the sound of the hiss, which is meant to kind of emulate an amplifier that's not quite working at its best, but it does definitely give kind of a vintage vibe to the sound. Now, I did say I will do some direct comparisons between the SV-2 and the SV-1's different sounds, and up next on the SV-2 are a couple of FM synthesis sounds, and there's two of them up here on the SV-1. So what I'll do is I'll play them down here on the SV-1, and on the SV-2, and play them up here on the SV-2, and give you guys a side-by-side comparison. As you can hear, although they're both definitely different, I like both of them as well. The second one up here on the SV-2 has more of a darker air. The one down here on the SV-2 is a bit more brighter and a little more thin sounding and a little bit just a different character. I can't necessarily say that one is better than the other. I do really like that second one of the SV-2. I think the second one of the SV-1. The second one of the SV-1 I like better than the second one of the SV-2, but hey, they're all good. I like them all. And I think you'll kind of see that as a recurring theme here as well. For the second EP category of the SV-2, we have a number of more different types of electric pianos. We've got like CP80 type pianos and a few other like digital pianos that Korg did in the past and a few other types of things like that. So let me quickly run through the EP2 section of the SV-2, and then I'll do another sound comparison between the EP2 bank up here. Let's check that out. So we've got a few more FM synthesis type sounds, this time layered in with strings and synth pads and all kinds of cool stuff. Now, very little of that corresponds to the electric piano category 2 up on the SV-1. The SV-1 has a few Rhodes, Wurlitzer sounds and a few others in here. And honestly, it's been a while since I played the SV-1 and I forget what 4, 5, and 6 actually are. So let me scroll through the sounds of the EP2 piano bank up here real quick, and then I'll do a comparison between two of my favorite whirly sounds. So up here on the SV-1, we've got a couple of whirly sounds and then a few different electric piano sounds, like a CP80 type of sound and a couple of other similar types of sounds. Now what I want to do here real quick, just to give you guys an actual true comparison of the sounds, is go back to the EP1 bank of the Korg SV-2 and select that sixth sound that I said I really liked. That is similar to the second sound up here of the second EP bank. I know some of this is confusing, I hope you guys are able to stick with me here, but the second sound of the second bank on the SV-1 is also a Wurlitzer with a chorus applied. So let me play back and forth between the two and just show you guys some of the differences. Like I said, I believe Korg has modified the sound of the choruses of the SV-2, and they give it a much more lively, interesting sound. Now you have to know that two of my favorite sounds of the old SV-1 were those two whirly sounds, and I knew they'd be difficult to beat. I think Korg may have done it, at least with this particular sound. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I loved this one up here in the SV-1, but I think the one down here in the SV-2 is even cooler. That to me just sounds so fun and so absolutely amazing that I just love playing with it. And of course, you can change the sound, the speed and intensity of the chorus. You can turn on and off the amps. You can increase the gain and change the drive of the amps and completely change the sound. You can EQ it all within the SV-2 or the SV-1 itself. And that's part of what I really loved about the old SV-1, and that's one thing that's totally stayed true with the SV-2 now, is that the amount of customization you have over the sounds just within the instrument itself, not including, external pedals and external plugins through a computer, just with the instrument itself, you can change the sound so radically. It's really, really wonderful. You have so much control with it, and it's so easy to use as well. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the whirly sound, because this is something I found kind of interesting between the SV-1 and the SV-2. That is the fact that the other whirly sounds, let me go back to number 1 here, which is our other whirly of the SV-1, they're a completely different approach. The Wurlitzer up here is more of a Wurlitzer 200. It's the gritty, growly, famous Wurlitzer 200. It's used by so many famous groups back in the day. I think The Who was one of the ones that made the whirly really popular. And down here is more of a mellow, warmer, softer, cottony type of Wurlitzer, more like a 200A or some other model that had a different sound than the 200. So you can definitely hear the difference here, and I'll talk about what that difference is, but just have a listen. I think it's one thing that's definitely changed between the SV-2 and the SV-1. So what has changed here? Well, of course, part of the thing is the actual sound of the instrument is slightly different, but one thing that's different about the whirly sounds of the SV-2 is the touch sensitivity. If I push the touch button here on the SV-1, you'll see that this first whirly sound has the touch sensitivity set to 4. This one has a touch sensitivity set to 5, but yet there's more to it as well. If I hit 4 down here, you'll still hear that the whirly up here is brighter and more punchy than the whirly down here. Have a quick listen. If I set the touch sensitivity all the way up to 2, which gives us the brightest, punchiest sound, and I'll probably turn my gain down a bit for that, you will hear that it sounds a bit more like the Wurley up here. Not quite the same, but closer. So that is something I noticed different between the SV-2 and the SV-1, is that the other Wurleys of the SV-2 are more mellow and more dull sounding, more just cottony sounding. Initially, when I unboxed the SV-2, I really didn't like it, but after I played around with them a bit, I realized that they're just different. They still sound really good, and they are a lot of fun to play with. They're just a different character. The sixth Wurley sound here of the SV-2, well, actually the fourth one, it's number 6 in the first bank. 6B has that bright, gritty sound that the old SV-1 has. The others are a different type of Wurley, so that's something interesting. One other thing I wanted to briefly mention here is the reverb of the Korg SV-2. I'm not a big fan of it. I was hoping that it would be upgraded, because honestly the reverb of the SV-1 wasn't really that amazing in my opinion. One weird thing I'm noticing here, specifically with the Wurley sounds, if you go to the hall reverb setting, you crank it all the way up to 10 on the SV-2. I'm using the Wurley number 6 here down here. And for the SV-2, if I come up here to the hall setting, crank it all the way up to 10, you will hear a definite difference, and I don't know why it's this way. It seems to be specifically with all the Wurley sounds and not much else of the SV-2. Don't know why it does this, but it does, and I'll play back and forth so you can hear the listen. Again, this is with a Wurley sound. It's number 6 down here, it's number 1 up here, with the hall reverb turned all the way up to 10 for both of them. Now, I do have to say that it is an interesting effect down there on the SV-2. It sounds like the mic is really far away from the Wurley in a very large room, but it's not the effect, it's not the same effect that the hall of reverb has up here. Up here, it just sounds like the room has gotten bigger, although it doesn't sound like a big hall, and down here, it just sounds like the instrument is really distant in a far-off subway tunnel. So I don't know why that sound is so much different of the reverb, but nonetheless, it is. And that's just one major difference I wanted to point out between the SV-2 and the SV-1 that I've noticed here. Let me move on to the piano section here, because this is also where you'll hear a big difference in sound. The sounds categories have been switched around. On the SV-1, it's ePiano 1, ePiano 2, Clavinet, piano, organ, and others. And down here, it's EP1, EP2, so the same as above. And then you've got piano 1, piano 2, and then clavier, and then other. So the sounds have switched around a little bit, and the priority seems to have moved a bit towards acoustic pianos type sounds. So let's have a listen to the first default acoustic piano of both of them. Again, there's more on the SV-2 than the SV-1, and we'll see how they sound. As you can hear, that default piano is definitely different sounding. Up here on the SV-1, it's thinner and brighter, and down here on the SV-2, it's more mellow and a little bit more warm sounding. That's a very interesting difference in sound between the two, and it's just kind of neat that Korg is slowly changing the sound. I do think I like the sound of the SV-2 acoustic piano, at least this default one, more than the default one of the SV-1, but it's still not perfect down here on the SV-2. I think the piano sounds definitely could be better. They still sound a bit sterile to me, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. I've tried analyzing the sound and listening very carefully and approaching it as if it was an acoustic piano. I'm thinking, if this was an acoustic piano, what would I say could be different in the terms of voicing, etc., and I really can't place it. But when I'm playing music on here on the SV-2's pianos, they just sound very, very sterile. They still do on the SV-1, but I think that they would have been improved more on that aspect of the SV-2. I'm not saying they're terrible. I still like the pianos down here of the SV-2, but they're just not as good as I had hoped, especially considering that we have a bigger focus of acoustic piano sounds and other piano types of the SV-2. We've got two dedicated categories to the piano, so I would have expected the piano sounds to be a bit better. Let's have a listen to another variant of the piano. This one down here is going to be another variant of the German Grand, the first piano we heard of the SV-2, and let's also listen to it on the SV-1 as well. That second variant of the acoustic piano of the SV-2 is one of my favorites on the SV-2. It sounds a lot less sterile than some of the others of the SV-2, and honestly sounds pretty amazing, especially compared to the SV-1. I was using the second piano sound up here, and then I decided to switch it back to the first piano sound, because the second piano sound of the SV-1 is a much different characteristic than the first one, and sounds a bit less like a real acoustic piano to me. So I decided to switch it back to the first one and give it a little bit more of a fair comparison. So you definitely can tell that Korg has improved the piano sounds over compared to the SV-1. I think that other manufacturers, such as perhaps Yamaha and Kawai with their higher end models, like perhaps the ES8, definitely would certainly give the SV-2 a run for the money on the piano sounds, and I think would probably come out on top. The Kawai and the P515, those instruments would probably come on top of the SV-2 when it comes to the acoustic piano sounds. However, the acoustic piano sounds of the SV-2 are definitely not terrible, and some of them are quite fun to play around with. I'm not going to run through all of them of the SV-2, because like I said, there's 12 different variants for the SV-2, 6 different variants for the SV-1. That's over 100 sounds to run through, and this video is getting pretty long. So I think I'm just going to skip past the acoustic piano sounds of the SV-2. I covered them in more detail in my original review, so if you really want to hear those, go check that out. But before I leave to the next acoustic piano section of the Korg SV-2, I wanted to discuss really quickly the feel of the action. The RH3 action is what's used in both of these instruments. It's what's used in the SV-1 and in the SV-2, and it's an action that Korg has been using since probably before the inception of the SV-1. And many people have said, I've noticed it in YouTube comments and online forums and stuff, people saying, Korg, come out with a different action. You're so lazy, all these things. People like to get mad at Korg for using the same RH3. I do not share those same views. I can understand why people would want to see a new and improved action. I definitely can understand it, but one thing you have to realize that there's a reason the RH3 has been used for over 10 years, and that's because it is a phenomenal action. Does it feel exactly like a real acoustic piano? No. Is it as good as the tippy top echelon of digital piano actions today, like the grand feel from Kawai? No. But it still is an amazing action, and it really feels great to play on. It can handle anything I throw at it. The only weakness is probably trills and mostly turns. Seem to be a bit difficult on the RH3 for some reason. It's probably just me, honestly. But everything else, when you're playing Baroque music or you're playing classical music or pop, rock, jazz, whatever it is, you throw it at the RH3 and it can handle it pretty much for the most part. Maybe 91% of things like turns and specific maneuvers like that are difficult to do. But for the most part, everything I throw at the RH3 action really feels amazing to play, and it's honestly great. A lot of people also might be upset that it doesn't have like an ivory feel key tops to them. They're just like gloss plastic. That typically really isn't a deal killer for me. I don't notice a huge difference between digital pianos with an ivory touch key tops and ones that don't have them. To me, they're just key tops, and they all, for the most part, feel about the same. Overall, I love the RH3 action, and I've had no issues at all with mine on the old SV-1 or on the SV-2. I know some people have had durability issues, but I think most of that comes from abusing the instrument and having accidents happen with it, like having it break and fall, rather than just breaking from normal use. I've never had my SV-1 break from playing very advanced, hard, bombastic classical pieces on it, and I don't think I'll have the same happen with my SV-2, which I do plan to use certainly for the next few years. Let's move on to the second acoustic piano sample set down here for the Korg SV-2, and I'll briefly run through a couple of these here. These are more like acoustic electric types, like CP80s and stuff that we've already heard up here on the SV-1. Here's a few versions of them down here on the SV-2. I won't run through every single one, but I'll just play a couple so you get an idea of what this piano category is made for, and there's a few cool ones in here. As you can hear, there's some really cool pads and the synth sounds in here, as well as some electric style piano sounds on the Korg SV-2. Some of these things the SV-1 just couldn't do, like those layered synths with the piano. The SV-1 had nothing like that on board. The next section of the SV-2 is the clavier section, which combines clavinet sounds and organ sounds. Let me just quickly do a quick back-to-back comparison of the clavinet sounds of the SV-2 versus the SV-1. I've never actually heard them side by side. I think they're pretty close, but we'll see right now. So there was a quick little taste of the different clavinet style sounds and the clavinet style sounds of the Korg SV-2. So there's 4 different clavinet sounds up here and 4 different ones down here. They all sound pretty good to me. I like the ones of the SV-2. I like the ones of the SV-1. You know, it's kind of a toss-up to me which ones of those are better. The clavier section down here also contains a harpsichord sound. Have a quick listen to that. There's actually 2 different harpsichord sounds there, and also it contains the organ section. There's 6 different organs of the SV-2, 6 different organs of the SV-1. The SV-1 has its own patch, or own section, own category dedicated to organs. For the SV-2, it's just lumped in with the clavier section. But nonetheless, this has 6 organs. This has 6 organs. Have a listen to those. So those are the organ sounds of the SV-1 and the SV-2. You can hear the SV-2 has 2 different church organ types. Those aren't available on the SV-1. They simply don't exist. But the SV-1 does have a couple of different varieties of tone wheel organs instead. There's 1 extra combo organ sound and 1 extra tone wheel organ sound instead. Between the 2, I think I like the organ sounds of the SV-2 a bit more, especially that gritty one. It really has this natural distortion of the SV-2 that sounds really great. The SV-1 does have a distorted rock organ sound, but it's not quite as good. But between the 2, I think I prefer the organ sounds of the SV-1. I mean, SV-2, excuse me. The SV-2, I think, has the better organ sounds. They're pretty good. The final category here is the others category, and this here, I think, is where the SV-2 really starts to show its differences. We've heard differences in tone. The Rhodes sounds are different, the Wurlitzer sounds are different, even the organs are different, but the others category is really where things start to get different. For starters, the default string patch, I think, is honestly pretty close to being the same between the 2. There's 2 variants of it down here in the SV-2. There's only 1 of the SV-1, and they're all pretty amazing. Have a listen. They're very similar in nature, but I think the ones of the SV2 sound a little more natural and a little bit better. They're both pretty dang sweet, though. I like both of them. Up here on the Korg and on the SV2, they both have a tape string sound, which is like a mellotron. I think that's about the same between the two of them, but one sound the SV-1 doesn't have is this really beautiful pad mixed with a choir, mixed with a synth. It's beautiful. The old SV-1 could just never do that. It never had the ability to do that, and that's something I love about the SV-2. Up next on the SV-2, the third sound, I actually don't remember what this one is, so let's check it out. A few different synth strings and synth type of pads. Now the fourth category down here on the Korg SV-2 gets really phenomenal. These are two of my favorite sounds of the entire instrument. The first one is a big grand orchestral sound with brass and timpani and octaved piano. It's just amazing. Have a listen to this. That is so much fun, and I just love that sound so much. The second version, B4B on the SV-2, is a pizzicato string sound mixed with a glockenspiel, mixed with the slow strings that you also don't have of the SV-1. One really cool thing of the SV-2 is that if you hit the function button, you'll see that the EQ lights begin to blink, and this actually acts as a mixer. You can turn on and off the different layers of the sounds, and you can also just increase and decrease the volumes instead. This also works with the damper noise on the acoustic pianos and the action and hammer noise of the electric pianos and clavinets as well, so it's a really nice touch that's also something the SV-1 wasn't able to do. A couple of other sounds in the other category I wanted to discuss is this cool synth sound that's remained the same of both the SV-1 and the SV-2. It's kind of funny because throughout this whole video we haven't had like a single sound that really lined up. I mean, the Rhodes sounds lined up, but they weren't identical. They were different characters on both of the instruments. But the one sound that's the exact same in the exact same position of both of these keyboards is this particular sound. If you go to the others category and number 5 on the SV-1, you'll get this sound. And if you go to the others category and you hit 5B on the Korg SV-2, you'll also get this sound. It's just a really cool synth sound, and I find it kind of cool that it's in the same exact spot on both digital pianos. There's a couple of other sounds in here as well that I could touch on, but this video has gone on for a very, very long time, so if you want to see each and every single sound of the SV-2, you probably might want to go check out my original review of it. As a final little wrap-up, there's a couple of other things I wanted to discuss, and one of those things is the favorite section of the SV-2. We now have the ability to be able to push this button in, the type button, to select a bank of favorites. If you look at the favorites buttons, you'll see that they say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on the buttons themselves. Above each button, there's a little letter. It'll say A, B, C, D, all the way through H. When you hit this type button and you select a favorites button that has that letter above it, you're selecting that bank, so bank D of the favorites. And within that bank, you then can choose a favorites within that bank. So you've now basically doubled the amount of favorites, actually more than doubled, really. It's gone up exponentially the amount of favorites you have. On the SV-1, you have 8 different favorites, and as a result, I never really used the favorites category for the SV-1. The favorites is a way, if you make a change to a sound, you can save it to a favorite to recall it later. I never used this of the SV-8 of the SV-1 because there were only 8 of them, and they had some cool preset sounds in there I didn't want to get rid of, like this one. I didn't want to get rid of that and write over it, so I've never used the favorite section. Now, though, because we have 8 different banks with 8 different favorite sounds available in each bank, we've now got 64 different favorite sounds, and so as a result, I'm definitely going to be using the favorites functionality of the SV-2 a lot more often. The final thing I wanted to point out of the SV-1 versus the SV-2 is that while there's been many small quality of life changes over the SV-1 compared to the SV-2, many things have improved. One thing that kind of has and kind of hasn't is seamless sound switching. The SV-1 didn't have this at all. For example, if I hold the sound and change the sound, you'll see the sound cuts out entirely. And while the SV-2 is able to switch between sounds and have the previous sound still sustain while you change the sound, like so, it's still not perfect because in certain categories and between certain sounds, there are still volume shifts. For example, in the second EP category, A4 and B4 have a particularly loud volume shift. As you can hear, and there's a few others that do it as well. One thing I noticed is if you're changing between the different categories and you have a note held down, the ambient sound, like the key click noises and all that, will actually activate as you change between different sounds. Have a listen. Leads to some very interesting sounds that you can create, but obviously this isn't perfect. Korg does say that if there's a sound that uses the amp sim section and you switch to a sound that doesn't use the amp sim section, you will hear a volume boost. And while this is true, it also partly isn't true, because even between sounds that don't use the amp sim, you can still get volume shift. So that would be something that I would love to see improved with the SV-2, is have that patched. But it is definitely better to have some sounds that can switch between them rather than having none that could switch, like on the SV-1. For those of you who have made it all the way to the end, I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this video, and if you have, I will also give you guys a wrap-up of the video as well, just kind of a recap, because we've talked about a lot and it's been a long video, so just as a recap, I wanted to discuss. The SV-1 is one of my favorite digital pianos of all time. I've had it for many years, and I've loved it from the day I've bought it up until today. The sounds are amazing, the feel is amazing, and the build quality and durability is the same. That hasn't changed to the SV-2. The SV-2 is still built with the same high build quality as the original SV-1. However, the SV-2 has a bunch of extra sounds, a bunch of small quality of life improvements, and a bunch of extra functionality as well. The sounds are changed and they have a different tone color, but they're still really fun to play with, and they're still super inspiring. And the SV-2, I think, is even more fun than the SV-1. While I do love the SV-2, I'm not sure I want to get rid of my SV-1, and honestly, I'm not sure I could really even have a complete studio without having both of these, because the SV-2 is so different from the SV-1 that it's not really, in my opinion, a replacement, but it's more of a accessory. It goes with the SV-1. I know I said that you wouldn't really want to use these both at the same time because the knobs have a radically different feel, and I still stand by that, but I think that here in the studio I'd definitely be able to take advantage of sounds in the SV-1 and in the SV-2, at least for the time being. One thing that kind of makes these amazing is there's not really anything like them on the market. These days, I think there are things that are a little more similar, like I think Krumar has an instrument that's meant to emulate vintage electronics, and I think Viscount or Viscount also has one that's similar too, but the SV-2 and the SV-1 are the only instruments on the market that have an actual vacuum tube inside to help warm the sound, or at least that's what Korg says, and especially when the SV-1 released, it was extremely unique. There was nothing on the market like it, and I think that still applies today. Like I said, Krumar has the 7, and I think also Viscount has an instrument that's meant to be a vintage type of experience, but those are a lot harder to get than even the difficult to get SV-2. You typically see those in your local music shop, but you will eventually see your SV-2s coming out in your local music shops. They're an amazing, amazing instrument, and I absolutely love them. While it's not perfect, honestly, no digital piano is, and even though it has a few small little flaws here and there, I love the SV-2, and I think it's absolutely amazing. I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this review between the SV-1 and the SV-2. It's a review I've been looking forward to making ever since the SV-2 came out, and it's finally here because the SV-2S was difficult to find, to say the least. I've tried for months and months to get one, and I think as the product line kind of goes on and it ages, they will become easier to find, hopefully. The default SV-2, the version without the speakers, is a lot easier to find, but I really wanted to get the SV-2S. First of all, I think it looks cooler because of the cream, and also I wanted to try out the speakers, which are actually pretty decent. So I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might want to go check out my channel if you're new. I've got lots of cool videos of pianos, organs, keyboards, digital pianos, and all kinds of other cool musical instruments. If any of that sounds cool, you might want to go check out my channel. If you want to subscribe, thank you very much. It definitely helps out the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.